So it's been 2 weeks since the trilateral agreement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia was signed that resulted in the massive loss of territories in Artsakh. So I think we should discuss what the geopolitical implications of this agreement have been, particularly for the three parties to the agreement, Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, but also looking at the way in which other regional actors and global players like Turkey, the United States, the OSCE, and Europe have been impacted or will be affected by this agreement, what the long-term prospects are, and then also what we can do as a community to try and push back against the disastrous terms of this agreement and ensure that there is a more equitable outcome for the people of Artsakh. So let's start with Russia. Russia was the one that brokered this agreement. Russia has been involved as a partner in this process for many years in trying to act as a guarantor for Armenia's security, but we also know that they sell weapons to Azerbaijan. They've been trying to play the role of the middleman for quite some time. What does Russia get out of this agreement? What does Russia gain from this?
I think looking at it from the context of the world powers trying to dictate or broker what happens regionally or internationally, Russia in this scenario would be seen, for lack of a better word, as the winner. And that would come on two fronts. The first is diplomatically. They have completely curbed the OSCE, the Minsk group, which was set up between them, the United States, and France. They have kind of, skirted around that, and they've come to their own agreement. This ceasefire that was signed, the agreement, however you want to name it, this was brokered by Russia. That's evident. Secondly, they've won on the militaristic front, because today there are troops in Artsakh where there weren't 40 days ago. Today they are the guarantors of safety in that region between the populations. I'm saying between the populations, but it should be noted that they are the guarantors of safety for Armenians in that region. And I'm saying that because every day we see more videos coming out of the displaced folks from Artsakh, from the villages that have to be evacuated, that are being given over to Azerbaijan, where war crimes are being committed, where civilians are being executed. So they have an important role. However, in all of that, to them, this is a military victory as well, because now they have troops, and these aren't just light peacekeeping troops. These aren't the troops that you're used to seeing when it comes to the UN. These are troops with tanks, with heavy armament. These are troops with weaponry.
It's very atypical of a typical sort of peacekeeping force that you would see. I mean, moving in that sort of heavy artillery. It's definitely a very Russian approach to peacekeeping that we've seen in Syria, that we've seen in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, in East Ukraine, in Crimea. So we are starting to see Russia really attempt to consolidate its presence and its influence there. I think it's also worth noting that we obviously a byproduct of Russia's involvement has been some semblance of security and a ceasefire for the Armenian people and for the people of Artsakh that Russia is the only one in any position to guarantee. But ultimately, for Russia, this had nothing to do with the Armenian people. This was about ensuring Russia's strategic objectives. Like you mentioned, it was about ensuring that the OSCE, US, and Europe were cut out of any material role on the ground. So it's definitely an interesting situation, a difficult situation for us. We need to be tempered in our expectations as to what Russia can, can't, will, or won't do in this situation. It's really, if one thing has defined Russia's foreign policy under Putin, it has been that Russia is in it for itself. It's definitely a pragmatic, realpolitik, dictated state when it comes to foreign policy and foreign intervention. So definitely we need to be, tempered in our approach to the role of Russia in the region.
Yeah, and what Russia does is for Russia's strategic interests, and just like what most nations do are for their strategic interests. I'd also note that Russia did not only avoid going through the Minsk group to come to any trilateral agreement, but they've also avoided, to some extent, and we'll go deeper into this, Turkey's involvement in all of this. Because if we remember, just months ago, one of Turkey's main statements when it was talking about its involvement in this war with Azerbaijan, where Erdogan outright said that he's involved in this war with Azerbaijan, was that Turkey wanted a role in the OSCE Minsk group.
Right.
So not only did Russia cut out United States and France, but they've also completely cut out Turkey from that equation. Now there's some other drawbacks to that we'll go into, but on that diplomatic stage, it's only been Russia that has taken center stage.
That's true, and I think when it comes to Turkey, I mean, we'll discuss this a little bit more, because Turkey definitely also comes out of this as a victor, in the same way that there are Russian troops in the region where there hadn't been before. There is now an official Turkish presence through a joint monitoring center
in Azerbaijan.
Yeah. But I think to the point you're making, what Russia has done is effectively neutered the OSCE as a force for conflict resolution in the region, and made it, I mean, almost redundant, unless we see some kind of concerted effort from the United States and France to re-engage with that process. But moving on to the next point, I mean, Azerbaijan is clearly a winner in this situation too. Perhaps not as much as they would like to believe, because it's really a victory that has come only with the aid of Turkey, and it's clear that Turkey's role made all the difference for Azerbaijan this time round, and Azerbaijan also probably doesn't want to see Russia with an expanded role in the region too. And we're already seeing from the opposition within Azerbaijan these claims that Aliyev didn't go far enough, and that this was a limited victory, but certainly not seen as a long-term solution to this crisis or this conflict that has plagued the Azerbaijani regime and humiliated their government for many decades now. But where does this leave Azerbaijan?
Before I answer that, I would also say that it's important to consider Azerbaijan considers this a victory. Aliyev considers this a victory. Azerbaijan has lands that they did not have before under their control. Azerbaijan has lands under their control that in the 1994 UN resolutions that they love pointing to all the time didn't even recognize that as part of Azeri land. And I'm talking about Shushi and Hadrut, and historically Armenian land that was never considered, So for them, that's in a way a victory. One thing we have to remember, though, that this war was not just a confluence of factors being the Azerbaijani military might, Turkish intervention, even Syrian mercenaries. It also had to do with COVID. It also had to do with U.S. elections. It also had to do an entire international community dealing with the worldwide pandemic. So to them, this was an opportune moment. This is something that they may never get the set conditions ever again. And unfortunately, and with the brutality that Azerbaijan does, they took advantage of this. However, one has to note that what they did do is use up much of that military that they've built up over the years. Much of that money that was poured in is now gone. They've also lost thousands of soldiers there. So they've got problems that have yet to hit home. But again, when we're looking at that map, it's very difficult to say that this was a loss, quote unquote, for Azerbaijan. And we have to be honest about that, and we have to be honest about that so that we can demand our territorial integrity, we can demand our self-determination, because if we're not honest about what they've taken and the damage we've lost, then we don't know what we're really going to be fighting for.
Absolutely. So I guess that brings us to Armenia and the situation in Armenia right now, and where that leaves us as a nation. What does this mean for Armenia right now?
It's a moment to, again, let's both acknowledge that we're diasporans, that we don't live in that country, and ultimately the people should and will have the final say in all of this. But what it does do is, both for the populace, for the political leadership in place, both the past and present and the future that's going to come, a reorienting of our strategical view of foreign policy, of our infatuation with looking towards the West, right? So for years, we've talked about the need to bring in NATO as an ally, overlooking the fact that one of NATO's strongest partners and the second strongest military in NATO is Turkey, the country that committed genocide against us and that won't admit to it. So we've looked to the West, and when we needed the West to look back most during war, they didn't. So Mike Pompeo came out, gave great statements about how they stand with Armenians. Trump at his rallies went and spoke about how we're with the Armenians. Macron gave strong words, sent delegations. But do you know what the West did, what Europe did? Nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
They gave us words. And while they gave us words, Turkey supplied drones, Turkey supplied mercenaries, Turkey supplied fighter jets.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a devastating outcome for Armenia, and I think we need to be honest about that. We can't try to claw some certain like potential minor victories out of this. You know what I'm saying? We can't pretend like this isn't as bad as it is. It's the single greatest loss of land in Armenian history since the First World War, since the Treaty of Kars, since the loss of Ararat, which was 100 years ago, almost to the date, which is a cruel irony of global history and geopolitics. We've now also seen some concerning points in this agreement when it comes to the Syunik province and the road between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan. We have, through this agreement, no determination on the status of Artsakh and what remains of Artsakh that is under Armenian control, governed by or mediated by Russian peacekeepers. We have no sense of what the status of the refugees from Artsakh is going to be. It looks like at least 30,000 are going to be permanently displaced, assuming that the other 70,000 that have been displaced return to their homes, which, let's face it, is not a sure guarantee right now. And then there's also the status of cultural monuments throughout those territories that are now under Azeri occupation, and what it means for the potential cultural genocide that could occur now. And we've already started to see statements and comments from the Ministry of Culture in Azerbaijan that are trying to erase Armenian history. We're starting to see the Caucasian Albanian myth resurface to try and rebrand ancient Armenian monasteries and churches, erasing their Armenian history and identity to cleanse the region of Armenian civilization in our indigenous lands. And these are all things left out of the agreement. They're things that I'm assuming are going to be open for negotiation should a negotiation process resume, although we have no clear understanding of what the time frame of something like that is going to be, which is a major flaw in this agreement because there are many questions left unanswered, perhaps more questions raised than answered at this point, and no clear path forward. Russia is more concerned with establishing and preserving a new status quo than it is about finding some kind of permanent solution to this crisis.
And we have no, direct or exact timetable from, the Armenian government on what is the process of the negotiations, what's still left in the air, what's still yet to be decided. It seems as though we kind of find out day by day, which, again, sheds some concern on the negotiating process of, are we still negotiating? Did we negotiate a treaty weeks ago? What's left to be, negotiated? And I think these are things that the Armenian nation has to kind of be aware of.
Definitely. I think this is a good point to bring in the US, France, and the OSCE, which are meant to be the parties to this conflict resolution process. As you mentioned, the OSCE Minsk group comprises of Russia, France, and the United States. Both the United States and France attempted to broker ceasefire agreements that fell apart within minutes or hours of them coming into effect. Both released statements that were supportive of Armenians but didn't result in any sort of practical action to ensure the rights of Armenians. And now we're in a situation where there seems to be a total monopolization of the peace process, of the conflict resolution process by Russia. In recent days and in the last week or so, we have seen the United States and France express an interest in involving themselves in the future negotiation over the territory and, of course, a lasting solution, because I think it is probably the shared belief, even though it might not necessarily be stated publicly, that the only way to resolve this crisis is going to be to determine the status of Artsakh, since that is the fundamental cause of this conflict. But where does this actually leave these Western powers when it comes to their strategic position vis-a-vis Russia or increasingly Turkey, now that this agreement has been signed and now that they've been cut out of that process?
In effect, I think Russia has shown that at any time it wants to, it can void the legitimacy of the other partners in the OSCE Minsk group. What were some of the preconditions? Territorial integrity, the non-use of force, like all of those things were broken. Those were the Minsk group's preconditions.
And self-determination.
And self-determination,
which is not even on the table right now.
Not only is it not on the table, but yesterday Aliyev came out with a statement saying that if we can't negotiate our way to what we want, which is the full recognition of all that land as Azerbaijani territory, then we will solve that by force. So there's further threats. So all of those preconditions of the OSCE Minsk group were undermined by Azerbaijan. On top of that, when it came to coming to a solution, it wasn't done through a trilateral agreement between Russia, France and
the United States.
It was done by Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And Russia was the broker of that deal. So I think there has to be, to show strength diplomatically for the West, that it has a presence in this region. There has to be some type of response, and I think that's where the diaspora comes in terms of what is the most value added response that we can, kind of direct our governments that we're a part of here in the diaspora towards, and then we can go into those issues, which there's a litany of.
There are many, and I think that the way in which we need to frame this, and the way in which the United States and these Western powers need to look at this, is that, I mean, you can't allow a revisionist, expansionist power like Russia to call the shots on these issues. You are effectively conceding influence to a country like Russia and a country like Turkey by stepping back from this process, by abrogating your responsibility as an OSCE member, as even as a country that is ostensibly stands for human rights and democracy. When you abandon one of the few democracies in the region, a country
at war with a dictator supported by an autocrat.
So I think the United States especially needs to look at this as a huge blow to its credibility as a country that is meant to represent those values of the liberal international world order. It's a huge, devastating blow to the credibility of multilateral diplomacy, and a major win for regionalism and regional dictators trying to usurp the US political order. And I guess on this note as well, because we've mentioned it a few times, Turkey and what Turkey's gains are here. I mean, Turkey's role in this conflict was unprecedented. We know that Turkey has been providing political support, material support to the military, logistical support to Azerbaijan's military for some time. There's been a semi-permanent Turkish military presence in Azerbaijan, in Nakhchivan, for some time. But what does this agreement mean for Turkey now? Turkey, which has now inserted itself very effectively into this environment.
I think it's important to talk, before we even talk about the military support that Azerbaijan received from Turkey, we have to talk about what is ideologically happening with the power brokers in the political sphere of Turkey. And I'm talking about Erdogan, I'm talking about AKP, and I'm talking about their fascination with this neo-Ottoman resurgence. And folks might think that, these might be like overblown or dramatic like statements to make. These are statements that Erdogan himself made, that they are going to continue the vision, word by word, the vision that their ancestors had set in the Caucasus 100 years ago. And what happened 100 years ago was a genocide of Armenians. Today what they're doing is trying to carve out pieces of Syria. Today what they're doing is trying to carve out pieces of Armenia for Azerbaijan. And today what they're doing, and this is really dangerous, and we have to be very cognizant of this, our militaristic threat from Turkey came from the West, right? Because they're on our western border.
Yeah.
Now they've got military bases in Azerbaijan, near Sunik. They've got military bases towards the east too. So this economically blockaded nation is now also militarily blockaded as well,
Yeah.
by a genocidal fascist nation.
Absolutely. And just back to that neo-Ottoman point, this is very much one peg in their ultimate goal. And it stems from this idea of pan-Turkism. It extends from the principle or the belief that Turkey and Azerbaijan are one nation, two states, that they share some kind of brotherly bond, that they want to create a geographically contiguous Turkic belt from Turkey to Central
From
Asia,
sea to sea.
from sea to sea. We see that this is also Turkey posturing, like you mentioned, in Syria, Turkey posturing in Libya, increasingly the Mediterranean at large, which is threatening NATO's NATO member states' interests, the interests of Cyprus, the interests of Israel as well, which is an interesting point because of Israel's relationship with Azerbaijan and the role that Israel played in enabling Azerbaijan's genocidal aggression against the Armenian people. And also, actually, to go into Cyprus a little bit deeper, we've started to see a little bit more posturing from the Turkish side on the island of Cyprus, which is under occupation. And this is another one of those inconsistencies in terms of the Western foreign policy approach to Turkey, is that you have Turkey, a NATO member state, occupying half of an EU member state's territory, and that hasn't resulted in any sort of real punishment when it comes to Turkey. So Turkey is continuing its policy. It saw an opportune moment, as you mentioned, with Azerbaijan to engage and to assert itself in the Caucasus, and now with
and
the...
that, I'm sorry to cut you off,
No, of
but
course.
I would also add that that is the lack of intervention was on behalf of the United States wasn't just detrimental in terms of the context of the OSCE Minsk group, but also in the context of Turkey,
Yeah.
of the amount that they've been able to militarily expand, of the proxy wars that they've been able to start. And all of this has happened because in the same way that they turned a blind eye to what's going on in Artsakh, the United States has turned a blind eye to so many of
Everything.
Erdogan's
Yeah,
mishaps
absolutely.
for the last 4 years. And you can use so many other nations as an excuse. How many times has Russia or Iran been sanctioned in the last few years for any type of, any type of thing that's been classified as a human rights abuse? Erdogan's daily work schedule is 24/7 human rights abuses. Yeah, and we're turning a blind eye because they're a NATO partner. And I think this is also one of the lessons that Armenians are painfully learning, that these purported ideals of democracy and freedom, they only apply to certain folks, and they get a pass for certain folks.
Absolutely. And again, this comes down to that huge blow to the credibility of these institutions that the United States played an integral role in founding, these values that the United States and Europe has sought to uphold. If they're applied selectively, they become absolutely meaningless. And it really does shatter the confidence of countries like Armenia, but other countries in Armenia's position that are looking down this path of democratization, that are looking to develop and integrate into the global economy. When they lack that support and the investment from these powers, especially in times of immense humanitarian crises and conflict, it really does do a huge amount of damage to those values and that process of democratization. So bringing it back to what we can do as a diaspora community, what's next? What are the steps that we take in order to redefine the terms of this agreement? What do we do to try and answer some of those unresolved questions now? And what leverage do we have as a diaspora community?
Yeah. So I think there's two emergencies here. There's the real life on the ground emergency with tens of thousands of displaced people, folks that are homeless, like entire regions of Artsakh that are left without whether it's heat, electricity, whatever, all that infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. That is always at the forefront of our mind, the people, and how we can help them resettle, how we can help Artsakh in the state that it is rebuild itself. that comes in many forms. That comes in us as a diaspora investing in the homeland, investing in Artsakh, investing in Armenian products, all that stuff. But in terms of from a diplomatic grassroots perspective, this is where we ask the United States to now, because they were late on the ball before, to come and step in and actually provide a tangible result in this field. And the ANC has already called for $250 million to be allocated in terms of emergency aid going to Armenia and Artsakh for these displaced families. There's been calls from senators like Bob Menendez, who's asked for $100 million directly to go to Artsakh and Armenia right now. So we have to hammer those points in. We have to keep pushing our legislators and our elected officials to send that aid. And then we have to focus on the recognition of Artsakh to make sure that we can safeguard these folks through whatever diplomatic means that are available to us. Though ultimately it's Armenians that will safeguard Armenian life, there's steps that we can take diplomatically to start setting the structure in place for an independent Artsakh.
Absolutely. And we spoke about the OSCE process. We spoke about the need for the engagement of the US and France, at the very least for them to counterbalance Russia's influence and monopolization, the terms of this agreement, but also to push further this process of actual sustainable long-term conflict resolution measures in this region. Because what is established now, this agreement, is barely qualifies as a ceasefire. It is a cessation of hostilities. It is the imposition of a Russian peacekeeping presence, whatever that's going to mean in the long term. But it doesn't go towards addressing the root cause of this crisis, right? Which is the status of Artsakh, which has been, the war erupted as a result of the persecution of Armenians by Azerbaijan back in the 90s. Armenians declared their independence as a means of securing their right to exist in the face of this genocidal threat. And we believe that the only way that we can secure and ensure the rights of the Armenian people in Artsakh is through self-determination, is through the right to independence. And we know, and this is why we implore on the government to pursue recognition, is that there can be no other long-term conflict resolution mechanism other than recognition. And this isn't a foreign concept to the United States. This is exactly what the United States said when it came to Kosovo's recognition back in 2008. They said this was the only way to ensure stability in the region, and they recognized that the decision was based on the fact that horrendous war crimes and human rights abuses were perpetrated against the Albanian Kosovars in the course of the war. So we are in a very similar situation here, and there is absolutely no doubt that recognition is the only pathway forward when it comes to peace and stability in the region. So we need to ensure the US re-engages with the OSCE Minsk process to actualize that. And as part of that as well, and it necessarily needs to be a part of this, the questions that came up in terms of what was left out of the agreement, particularly in terms of the resettlement of refugees and ensuring that they have the ability to return to their homes in Artsakh, and that there is a security mechanism to ensure they can do that. And of course, the cultural rights of those of the Armenians, particularly when it comes to churches, monasteries, other cultural monuments and sites that are now under Azerbaijani occupation, and what the United States can do as a player in the international arena to ensure the security and the integrity of those sites. Because we've seen what Azerbaijan has done to Armenian cultural sites when it comes to their occupation. Nakhchivan, 28,000 monuments destroyed in the early 2000s. We can't trust them to ensure the integrity of our culture and our civilization in those lands they control now. So we need to see the United States, the OSCE, Europe as a whole step in and play that role to secure those sites.
And we need to understand that when they destroy, bulldoze, and erase these monuments, this isn't just a reflection of savagery or brutality. This is a calculated, coordinated, strategic move. Those khachkars, those churches are is like a history book, and each one of them is a page in it. So every single one that they erase, along with it, they erase the trace of Armenians on that land. And that's why it's so valuable to us, because it's part and parcel to our territorial integrity on that land, of our DNA, of our roots, of our history that can be traced to those monuments.
Absolutely.
And yes, the U.S. needs to step up on that front. And on the call for recognition, which is one of the most important ways to make sure that there's safety and peace, lasting safety and peace in the region, we need the OSCE to do so. We also need the nation of Armenia to recognize Artsakh as well, and we've seen hints from it. Even Putin, in an interview, suggested that Armenia should recognize Artsakh, and it makes it easier for Armenians in the diaspora to go to their respective governments and say, recognize this nation.
Absolutely.
Because the response that we get is, Armenia hasn't even recognized it yet, so how is it a realistic, expectation of us to do so? So, and part of the reason that Armenia never did was it was thought to be a provocation of war.
That's already happened.
Well, the war happened,
And we lost.
And we've lost, and more was lost than what was naturally in consideration to be conceded or whatever that may be. So we need to have the Armenian government take a clear, strong stance on this. We as the diaspora need to hammer in on this. This is how we guarantee not just the right to Armenian land, but guarantee the safety of Armenian life.
Absolutely.
The recognition of art.
Absolutely. So the best way to engage with this process is to go to anca.org/alert. That will take you to an action alert page that will allow you to contact your Congress members and put pressure on them and encourage them to engage with the many resolutions that are currently circulating Capitol Hill right now, calling for condemnation of Azerbaijan and Turkey's aggression, calling for the recognition of Artsakh, calling for the imposition of sanctions against Turkey and Azerbaijan, as well as targeted sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against individuals in Turkey and Azerbaijan involved in the commissioning of war crimes, as well as to call on the US to engage more readily with the OSCE Minsk group to ensure that there is a renegotiation of the terms of this agreement that provides space for Artsakh's recognition and a determination of status, the preservation of cultural monuments, and the immediate provision of development assistance to Armenia and Artsakh to ensure that there can be a reconstruction and economic development process following this devastating loss. So with that, is there anything else, Gev?
I think that we've seen movement, whether you can look to Netherlands, who recently passed a sanctions bill. We can look to France, whose House is calling on reviewing a bill to recognize Artsakh. We are seeing movement, but we need to continue adding fuel to that fire as the diaspora. And look, this war was the culmination of preparation on the Azerbaijani side for over 30 years, economically, militarily, diplomatically, through lobbyists, through whatever. They've had 30 years to prepare for this. If Armenians, in the way that they were unified in the last 40 days, and the way that they came together from all across the world, and the attention, that engagement that was given to that homeland, if we keep this up, this is our roadmap to our victory. It is this eternal engagement with our homeland, not something that we tune into war to war, not something that we tune into protest to protest. We have to be continuously engaged with the development of that country, of our country. And
Absolutely.
and if we do that, the future can hold a lot more brighter outcomes. And we're seeing that today. Azerbaijan spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of political cards. They burned a lot of diplomatic bridges to do what they did. And currently, their crude oil reserves are going down. Their economy isn't in a great shape. And they are going to run out of the resources that they've had to impose the brutality that they have upon the Armenian people. And our nation can still grow, it can still develop, and it can still get stronger, but it's going to be with our continuous eternal engagement.
I mean, absolutely. And we need to take the time to grieve, to accept and understand that this was a defeat, this was a loss, but we also need to acknowledge that this isn't the end. And we can't think of this as the end, because if we allow that to take over, then we're not going to get anywhere. We need to pull ourselves together as a community and as a nation and focus now on the path ahead and the many, many priorities and actions that we can take as a community to ensure the best outcome for Armenia and Artsakh moving forward, and continue to, as you said, remain united, because the diaspora is Armenia's competitive advantage. Azerbaijan has its oil, but Armenia has a community, and you can't buy that community, and that community is not going to run dry like the oil fields will. And we need to keep that in sight. We need to remember that and allow that to guide us and strengthen us in the many battles that are going to come for years from now.
So moving forward, all for Artsakh, unity for Artsakh, above everything,
above individuals,
above political leanings, above parties.
Mm-hmm.
Artsakh, as Monte Melkonian said, if we turn the page on Artsakh, then we turn the last page of Armenian history, and we can't at any cost afford to do that.
And with that, we'll end this edition of Artsakh Now. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.